This is Group 15's ethical analysis of the Challenger shuttle disaster. Group 15 includes Nick Roth, Jordan Ring, Silas Graves, Jacoby Dar, John Carson, Blake Yancey, and Tanner Burke. So a little background on the Challenger shuttle disaster surrounding the launch. NASA was anxious to launch the Challenger due to several pressures. There was economic considerations, political pressures, and scheduling backlogs that kept happening. The European Space Agency brought along competition to prove the cost and effectiveness to be worth it and possibly bring about the potential for commercialization of shuttle trips. Essentially, they were looking to privatize the space program. There was also pressures to launch the Challenger in time for President Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address. During the address, he would talk about the importance of education and talk about the first teacher in space who was aboard the Challenger. Basically just a push for scientific and political power in the United States relative to the rest of the world. So a little bit about the launch failure. Seconds into Challenger's final flight code STS-51-L, the Challenger tragically erupted into a fireball, leaving only debris falling from the sky. It was initially unknown why the launch had failed, but was soon after released by the engineers in NASA that there was an O-ring failure that had caused a release of fuel in the wrong compartment and outside of the combustion chamber, which had caused an explosion. The question was, why had such a simple part like an O-ring caused such a huge project to fail? Here's a little bit of an image to explain what we're talking about. So here is the Challenger shuttle. You can see it written on the wing. This is a reusable capsule that NASA meant to fly and refurbish and did on several occasions. The tall orange tower in the center is the main external fuel cell, and these pods flanking the left and right are external solid booster rockets. So a little bit about the launch delays. There were several delays encircling Challenger on the day of the launch. That would eventually prove to be the driving factors in the mistake leading to the disaster. The first delay occurred when the weather front moved into Florida that brought rain and cold temperatures. Normally this wouldn't delay a shuttle launch, but the vice president was planning to come and watch the launch, so they called off the launch early to avoid an unnecessary trip from the VIP. The second delay was caused by a defective micro switch in the hatch locking mechanism, and by the time they had finished fixing the issue, it had become too cold and wind conditions were too high in order to launch. So a little bit about a contracted company under NASA, Thiokol. They were the people who contracted the O-rings that failed. Their O-rings were designed to prevent joint rotation in that tall orange tower we saw earlier in the presentation. After a cold launch day, Thiokol found black soot and grease caused by gas blowby around their rings, which meant they had contracted in cold weather and they were performing incorrectly. And because of this, Thiokol was testing their O-rings between 50 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which was the normal operating temperature launch conditions for the Challenger shuttle. A little bit about the rush to launch. The predicted temperatures for the launch were around 20 degrees Fahrenheit in this third iteration, in this third attempt to launch. Thiokol had presented studies initially showing NASA that their rings would fail in such low temperatures outside. And they did this the night before through a teleconference prior to the launch. After the presentation, Thiokol had a quick internal meeting where one of their higher-ups, Gerald Mason, made the managerial decision to tell NASA that while the cold temperatures did affect their O-rings, they should be able to proceed with the launch. And he is responsible for the famous quote, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." Basically, in a sneaky way, saying that money is more important than safety here. On the launch day, conditions were even worse than expected. Temperatures got as low as 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed on the launch pad, and which concerned NASA's engineers about launch conditions outside of the O-ring failure. At liftoff, the O-rings were too cold to seat properly because it was so cold, which caused the combustion gases to slip by and burn a 70-degree arc around them. Due to this failure, the Challenger would explode about 73 seconds into the flight. A look at the ethical analysis of NASA. NASA is more of an overarching organization rather than a company. Because of this, they have contractors construct and advise their personnel, and they rely on those contractors to relay clear and truthful information so that they can make the best decisions for their launches. NASA was advised by Thiokol and all their other contractors that conditions were safe for launch, and there was no reason to believe that NASA would have attempted the launch had they known that these O-rings would fail. The only information that NASA had that would have caused them to not launch was the atypically cold weather conditions. We'll look at Thiokol's actions. They had not tested their product within the predicted launch conditions. As stated before, they had tested between 50 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And there was reason to believe that the product would fail under such cold temperatures. Internally, inside of Thiokol, this information was known, and Thiokol chose to give the go-ahead to NASA, though engineers in the company expressly said not to launch. You can see that previous quote, "Put on your managerial hat, not your engineer hat," playing out here. I'll look at the ethical code that they really violated. In terms of public interest, Thiokol chose to risk the safety of the astronauts on board of the Challenger rocket in order, or at the prospect of corporate gain. Basically, they valued the well-being and health of their company more than the potential risk that they were providing for the astronauts on board. In terms of competence, Thiokol chose to operate a product in conditions that they hadn't tested and were unsure of how their product would behave. They had seen failures in colder conditions and had not experienced such cold conditions. And because of that, they had not tested the conditions that they had launched in. And so there was no promise that their product would perform as promised. In terms of being a faithful trustee, Thiokol was a contractor for NASA and should have behaved as so. But Thiokol did not disclose all of the pertinent information to NASA in order that NASA make the best safety call. Instead, they withheld the risks of the launch, and NASA gave the go-ahead, which caused the critical failure. In terms of deceptive acts, Thiokol informed NASA that they had tested their product under the predicted for the launch. They told NASA that they had tested within a similar range as the flight was operating, which is in fact not true. So you can see that there was several ethical breaches that Thiokol chose to make in order to, one, better their company, and two, save their Hainan whenever Challenger failed. And that concludes our ethical analysis.